At 68 years old, 3 years after burying my wife of 38 years, I drove 500 miles to meet the woman I had spent 4 decades calling the one that got away. 8 months later, sitting across from her in a small seaside diner while she meticulously sorted her blood pressure pills into a plastic weekly dispenser, I looked into the eyes of my 20-year-old college sweetheart and realized I was having breakfast with a complete stranger. The booth was upholstered in cracked red vinyl. Outside, a gray Atlantic drizzle blurred the salt-crusted windows of the diner. Julianne was 68, the same as me. She had lovely silver-streaked hair, elegant reading glasses resting on the bridge of her nose, and delicate wrinkles around her eyes. She was lining up 3 blue capsules and 2 small white tablets beside her cup of decaf tea with methodical, practiced precision. "Henry, make sure you take your cholesterol pill before we walk down to the pier," she said without looking up, her voice crisp, polite, and managing. "The ocean wind gets sharp after 10, and you know how your chest tightens when the dampness rolls in." "I took it at 6 this morning, Julianne," I replied softly. She paused, looking at me over the top of her tortoiseshell frames with a slight frown. "Did you take it with food? You always get acid reflux if you take it on an empty stomach." "I told you that on Tuesday." "I'm fine," I said. I looked down at my plate of scrambled eggs and toast. There was no anger between us. There was no betrayal, no shouting, and no malice. But sitting in that vinyl booth, watching her adjust her pill compartments, the warm, golden fog of 40 years of romantic longing evaporated completely. For 40 years, I had kept a black and white photograph from 1975 tucked inside an old edition of Keats' poetry. In that picture, Julianne was 20, laughing beneath a canopy of Spanish moss at the University of Georgia, her dark hair blowing across her face, radiant with the reckless promise of youth. For 40 years, whenever life became difficult, heavy, or ordinary, a quiet corner of my mind whispered that Julianne was the great unfinished masterpiece of my life. Yet here we were, 2 elderly people in windbreakers, comparing prescription schedules and discussing joint pain, trapped in a rented vacation cottage, because we had both tried to turn a phantom into a life partner. To understand how a retired history teacher ends up chasing ghosts down the Atlantic coast, you have to look at the silence that grief leaves in an empty house. In 2021, my wife Clara suffered a sudden stroke in our kitchen in Savannah. We had been married for 38 years. Clara and I were not a tragic romance from a poetry book. We were an ordinary, resilient, deeply loving couple. We raised our daughter Rebecca on a tight teacher's salary. We patched our own roof, painted our own porch, held hands through economic downturns, and learned how to forgive each other's worst habits. When Clara died, the quiet in our house in Savannah was devastating. Every room held 40 years of our shared rhythm. The dent in the sofa where she read her mysteries, the specific squeak of the 3rd step on the stairs, the sound of her garden shears clicking outside the window on Saturday mornings. Grief does strange things to the human mind. When the present is unbearable and the future feels like an empty hallway leading nowhere, your mind starts searching backward for a time when you were whole, young, and untouchable. One lonely evening in my 2nd year of widowhood, while scrolling through my computer late at night, an old name popped up on a social alumni page, Julianne Mercer. Her profile picture showed a graceful older woman standing in a sunny garden. Her status indicated she was a retired librarian living in Virginia, widowed 4 years earlier after a 35-year marriage to a civil engineer named Robert. My heart gave a strange, youthful leap that I had not felt since Clara fell ill. I sent a short, hesitant message. "Hello, Julianne. I don't know if you remember me from the campus library steps in 1975, but I saw your profile and wanted to send my warmest regards." 3 hours later, her reply came back. "Henry Sullivan, of course I remember you. You were holding a volume of Keats and forgot your umbrella." That single message opened a floodgate that had been sealed for 42 years. In 1975, Julianne and I were inseparable for 18 months. We were young, idealistic, and deeply infatuated. But when I received my military draft notice and later took a teaching post in southern Georgia, while her family relocated to Richmond, our young romance fractured under the weight of distance, immature pride, and changing circumstances. We never had a bitter breakup. We simply drifted apart, leaving our story suspended in that dangerous, pristine territory of what might have been. Within 2 weeks of reconnecting online, our messages turned into 2-hour nightly phone calls. Talking to Julianne felt like drinking from a fountain of youth. On the phone, we didn't talk about our creaking joints, our doctor appointments, or the crushing loneliness of our empty houses. We talked about the 1970s. We talked about campus coffee shops, old record albums, poetry, and the dreams we had before mortgages, children, and funerals claimed our lives. When I heard her laugh through the receiver, I wasn't a 68-year-old widower with reading glasses and a sore knee. I was 20 again, sitting on the warm grass under the Georgia sun, convinced that life was an endless horizon. "Henry," she whispered one night during our 4th month of calls, "do you ever think about why we found each other again after all these years? It feels like the universe giving us a second chance." "I think about it every day, Julianne," I answered, my voice trembling with an emotion I mistook for destiny. 6 months into our rekindled connection, I drove 500 miles north to meet her in Charleston for a long weekend. When she stepped out of her car in front of the historic inn, wearing a cream sweater and a silk scarf, my breath caught. Time had aged her, but her smile was the exact smile from my college memory. We hugged on the sidewalk. It was a warm, emotional embrace that felt like closing a 40-year wound. That first weekend was pure magic. We walked along the Battery, ate oysters by the harbor, and spent hours laughing about old mutual friends and professors. Everything seemed effortless because we were living entirely inside a shared museum of our youth. We only spoke of things that happened before 1977. When I returned to Savannah, I felt like a new man. I bought new shirts, started walking 2 miles every morning, and began dreaming of combining our lives. My daughter Rebecca, however, watched my sudden transformation with quiet caution. One Sunday afternoon, while helping me prune the azaleas in my backyard, Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron and looked at me seriously. "Dad, I want you to be happy," she said gently. "I know how hard it's been since Mom died, but you've only spent 6 days in person with Julianne in 40 years. Are you falling in love with who she is today, or are you just trying to escape how much you miss Mom?" I felt an immediate surge of defensive pride. "Rebecca, Julianne and I have history," I insisted. "We loved each other before you were even a thought. Life got in the way back then, but we have a chance to finish what we started." Rebecca looked at the garden, her eyes full of sorrow. "Dad, history from 40 years ago isn't a life. You and Mom built a life. Be careful you don't trade a real memory for a daydream." I dismissed her warning as the overprotective anxiety of a daughter who didn't want to see her mother replaced. 2 months later, Julianne and I decided to take the next big step. We rented a charming 2-bedroom seaside cottage on the coast of North Carolina for a full month. We viewed it as a trial run for living together permanently. We arrived on a sunny Saturday in October, our trunks filled with groceries, books, and suitcases. For the first 48 hours, the excitement carried us. But by the 4th day, the harsh, inescapable friction of daily life began to strip away the romance. The problem with reconnecting after 40 years is that you don't just reunite with a person, you collide with 40 years of habits, loyalties, and patterns that were formed without you. Julianne was not the spontaneous, carefree 20-year-old girl from the university lawn. She was a 68-year-old matriarch who had spent 35 years running a household with an engineer who lived by rigid schedules. She woke up at 5 in the morning and expected the cottage to be fully lit and functional by 6. She was deeply anxious about cleanliness, wiping down counters 3 times after every meal. She had strict dietary rules, refusing to eat salt or dairy, and commented constantly on my choice of butter and bacon. Her deceased husband, Robert, was an invisible third resident in the cottage. Every conversation somehow wound its way back to him. Robert always organized the spice rack alphabetically. She would observe while I cooked. Robert always checked the tire pressure every Sunday morning. Robert never left his reading glasses on the coffee table. At first, I listened with polite patience, but by the second week, a quiet resentment began to simmer in my chest. Julianne didn't want a new partner. She wanted an echo of her late husband, wrapped in the nostalgic face of her college boyfriend. Worse still, I realized I was doing the exact same thing to her. Whenever Julianne rearranged the living room cushions, I found myself irritated because Clara had always arranged them differently. When Julianne spoke during the evening news, I missed Clara's quiet companionship. When Julianne complained about the coastal humidity, I longed for Clara's easygoing laughter. We had both entered that cottage believing we were reuniting with our first love. In reality, we were 2 lonely, grieving widows trying to force 2 entirely different lives, shaped by decades of devotion to other people, into a single narrow box. The climax arrived on a chilly Thursday evening during our 3rd week. I had bought 2 tickets to a local acoustic concert in town featuring folk songs from the 1970s. I thought it would reignite that magical spark from our college days. We sat in the dimly lit hall. The band began playing an old song we had listened to on my dorm room record player in 1975. I smiled, reached across the table, and took Julianne's hand. Her fingers were stiff, and she gave my hand a polite, brief squeeze before pulling it back to adjust her wool scarf. "Henry, the amplifiers are far too loud in here," she whispered, rubbing her forehead. "And this wooden chair is killing my sciatica. Can we please go home after this song?" I looked at her tired, strained face in the dim stage light. The music was loud. The room was drafty. My own lower back was aching. We weren't 20. We weren't college sweethearts on a romantic date. We were 2 aging people sitting in a drafty hall, exhausting ourselves trying to recreate an emotion that had expired 4 decades ago. "Let's go, Julianne," I said softly. We drove back to the cottage in complete silence. The only sound was the rhythmic swipe of the windshield wipers against the glass. When we got back, Julianne made her decaf tea, and I sat at the small kitchen table. She set her mug down, pulled her plastic pill dispenser from her purse, and began sorting her evening medications. I looked at the blue capsules. I looked at her hands. "Julianne," I said, my voice calm, level, and completely devoid of bitterness. She looked up. "Yes, Henry? We aren't in love with each other, are we?" She froze, holding a small white tablet between her thumb and index finger. She looked at me for several long seconds. The defensive, managing mask she had worn for 3 weeks slowly dropped, revealing a profound, weary sadness. She set the pill down on the table, pulled off her reading glasses, and let out a long, trembling breath. "No, Henry," she whispered, her eyes filling with quiet tears. "We aren't. We loved who we were in 1975, I said gently. And we were so lonely after losing Robert and Clara that we convinced ourselves we could go back." Julianne reached across the table and placed her warm palm over mine. This time, the touch was real, honest, and comforting, not as lovers, but as 2 old friends who had survived the long journey of life. "I loved Robert for 35 years, Henry," she said softly, a tear rolling down her cheek. "I built a life with him. My memories, my habits, my heart, they belonged to that life. When I looked at you on the phone, I thought I could have my youth back without the pain of losing him. But you can't erase 35 years. And you can't erase Clara," I replied, feeling a deep, clean wave of relief wash over my soul. Clara earned every single corner of my heart through 38 years of real life. Trying to replace that with a college daydream was an insult to her and an insult to you. We stayed up for another hour, drinking tea and talking with the effortless honesty that only arrives when illusions are completely abandoned. We didn't fight. We didn't exchange bitter words. The next morning, we packed our suitcases with calm mutual care. We cleaned the cottage together, locked the front door, and drove down to the local diner for breakfast before parting ways. That was the morning in the cracked vinyl booth. Watching Julianne finish sorting her pills, I didn't feel heartbreak. I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Julianne hadn't given me a second chance at romance. She had given me something far more valuable. She had awakened my heart from the numbness of grief, and in doing so, she had shown me the irreplaceable value of the real life I had actually lived. We walked out to the parking lot in the cool autumn air. I loaded her suitcase into her car. She turned, wrapped her arms around my neck, and kissed my cheek with genuine affection. "Thank you, Henry," she whispered, "for 1,975, and for today." "Thank you, Julianne," I said. "Take care of your garden." She got into her car, backed out of the space, and drove north toward Virginia. I stood by my car, watching her taillights until they disappeared around the coastal bend, and felt completely at peace. I drove the 500 miles back to Savannah with the car windows cracked, letting the southern breeze fill the cabin. When I unlocked the front door of my house in Savannah that evening, the rooms were still quiet. The sofa still held its familiar shape. The garden outside was still waiting. But the house was no longer a tomb of grief. It was a home filled with the rich, honorable tapestry of a real life well lived. I walked into my study. I took down the volume of Keats from the bookshelf and pulled out the faded 1,975 black and white photograph of 20-year-old Julianne. I looked at her laughing face, smiled at the sweet memory of our youth, and placed the photo inside a small cedar keepsake box in my desk drawer. Then I picked up the framed color photograph on my desk, the picture of Clara and me on our 30th anniversary, our faces lined with age, our hair silver, our hands clasped tightly together against a windy mountain overlook. I wiped a speck of dust from the glass and set it proudly in the center of the desk. I am 71 years old now. Looking back on those 8 months of chasing a 40-year-old memory, I understand now the subtle trap that nostalgia sets for the aging heart. When you lose the person who shared your life, or when the weight of getting older begins to press down upon your shoulders, your mind plays a seductive trick. It tells you that your youth holds the answers to your present pain. It tells you that the one who got away was the secret to an unbroken, perfect happiness. That is a beautiful, dangerous lie. First love is sweet because it was never tested by the grinding reality of existence. It never had to pay an overdue electric bill, sit in an emergency room at 2 a.m, or forgive a harsh word spoken in exhaustion. Real love is not the spark of youth. Real love is the accumulated weight of shared struggle, patience, and decades of choosing to stay. Never try to resurrect an old daydream to heal the loneliness of your old age. Honor the past for the sweet chapter that it was, but live with your feet firmly planted in the truth of who you are today. Most afternoons now, I sit in the shade of the live oaks in Forsyth Park in Savannah with a book. I watch the young college students walk by, holding hands and laughing beneath the Spanish moss, full of wild dreams and unfinished stories. I smile at them with warmth and understanding. Their story is just beginning. Mine has already been written, chapter by beautiful, painful, ordinary chapter. And for the first time in many years, I know that my story was more than enough. If you have ever found yourself looking backward at an old memory, wondering about the path not taken, or learning how to cherish a real life over a romantic illusion, I would love to read your reflections in the comments below. Sharing our lived truths is how we find perspective and grace in these later chapters. And if this story brought a sense of comfort or clarity to your day, please like the video and consider subscribing to join our community for the next reflection. Until then, take good care of yourself and cherish the life you have truly lived.